So, welcome back to the Bioenergy course. So, in the last class, we started about the gasification. Last two classes we dealt with gasification. We talked about the basic concept of gasification, followed by the chemistry involved in it, the two-stage combustion process which is involved, unlike the regular combustion which is a one-step process. So, when we started, we decided that we will have this section in 5 different subheadings. We started with the introduction, we talked about the basic chemistry, and then we were supposed to talk about the pre-treatment of the feedstock or the biomass to be used, followed by the properties of the biomass, and final phase will be the design of the gasifier, what are the different kind of designs and what are their advantages and disadvantages, and what is the output and the efficiency. So, we have talked about the introduction, we have talked about the basic chemistry. So, today what we will be starting off with, we will be talking about this part, the feedstock treatment, followed by the feedstock properties. Okay. So, let us resume today with these two aspects. So, we will be talking about feedstock treatment, which is our section 3 or part C of the gasification. Okay. So, what we really meant by feedstock treatment? Essentially, feedstock treatment varies or is a function of two different parameters. One is what kind of gasification process we want to follow. Will it be an thermochemical? Will it be a biochemical? Or what kind of gasifier we will be using? Whether we will be using fluidized bed or whether it will be fixed bed. We will be coming to this all this classification. Plus, what kind of materials we are using. Is it a wood or is it a crop residue? Is it some other form of bio waste? Depending on the treatment protocol or the treatment methodology varies. And as a matter of fact, here we will be just covering some of the basic parameters. These basic parameters will remain constant. In day-to-day practical problem solving, one has to improvise upon these basic parameters. Suppose you wanted to convert a banana waste, okay, or some kind of a fruit waste or some kind of a vegetable waste, some kind of a wood waste. So, for each one of them, they will be coming with some inherent issues which has to be resolved under these basic parameters. Okay. So, let us enumerate what are the feedstock treatment things. So, in terms of the feedstock treatment, degree of pre-treatment, or you can call it a pre-treatment actually, because before you introduced it into the gasifier, degree of treatment or pre-treatment, treatment of the biomass feedstock is dependent on the gasification technology. Biomass feedstock is a function of the, is dependent on or is a function of gasification technology. Okay. So, this comes with some critical issues. What we will be doing? We will enumerate the key problem areas for feedstock treatment. Okay. Key problem areas or critical parameters, critical parameters. So, among these critical parameters, one aspect is the drying. We will come one by one into them. Let us enumerate all of them. Second one is the particle size of the feedstock. Third thing is fractionation. And the fourth aspect is leaching. These are the key problem areas which we will be discussing. And as I mentioned just a couple of minutes back, depending on the kind of feedstock you will be coming across, which will be used for converting or for gasification, you have to improvise upon these basic parameters. Okay? So, there is no set uniform rule that these things will always work. No, you will have to modify it. Okay. So, now let us talk about the drying parameters. Okay. So, we have enumerated all of them. Now, one by one we will be talking about the individual parameters. So, drying. Okay. So, in terms of drying, the moisture level which is most optimal, which is considered as kind of works most of the time, moisture around 10 to 15%. Okay. Moisture level below 10 to 15%. So, typically around 9 or sometime maybe 12 or something, where you will get the best results. But when we talk about drying, one has to realize that this is another thing, always keep in mind. I have highlighted this point earlier, again I am highlighting that needs energy, or there are two ways you can dry a sample. Either you have one route will be sun drying. This is very common in drier parts of the world, semi-arid tropics, tropical regions, as well as drier part of the earth where humidity is low, you really can dry it. So, this is energetically favorable because you really do not need to consume energy, or you have to have extra energy input for drying. Whenever we give an extra energy input, so it means you are spending certain amount into it. Okay. You are spending some money into it. So, that adds up to the fuel cost. Well, we will talk about the economics. These are the points one has to take into account. What kind of sample or what kind of feedstock you are obtaining to be processed. Okay. So, this is the moisture level below 10 to 15%. This is one of the critical point. Second, we will talk about the particle size. So, particle size, a typical particle size is which is followed, feed particle size is around 20 to 80 millimeter, which is in terms of the diameter we are talking about. Feed particle size around 20 to 80 millimeter. So, here one aspect one has to realize. So, just say for example, this is the particle size. Okay. And here you have the gas which has to percolate through. In the blue I am drawing the gas. So, you have to have a very optimal particle size. The reason being, of course, one can argue here that if there are two things before we put forward the argument, is the maximum area of the particle should come in contact for the reaction to take place. That gives us an idea that if we reduce, now if you follow this, if I reduce this size to this much like this, we will have more and more area under the, more and more will be covered by the gas molecules, or the reaction area will be much more higher. But if we do so, we come across a problem which we will be dealing later, is this will lead to a clogging. Many a times the finer the particles, it leads to some form of a clogging at the different orifices of air orifice or exhaust orifice, and it reduces the efficiency of the system. Whereas, if you go up with the particle size, something like this, you are compromising on the reaction area. So, you have to go for an optimal particle size, and that optical particle size will be a kind of a trade off you will be doing essentially. So, there will be a trade off which you will be doing in order to get the maximum out of a gasifier system. Okay. And this particle size parameter, again, though I am giving you 20 to 80 millimeter, this kind of varies with system to system. It is not a very uniform one, but this is the kind of range where one can ballpark, this is where most of the gasifier will give decent amount of efficiency. Okay. So, this is the next aspect to be taken into consideration about the pre-treatment. Okay. The third aspect is fractionation. 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 So, what is fractionation? So, fractionation, as the name indicates, you are fractioning the system. In other words, what does that mean? It is a process by which you separate the sample depending on their particle mass or whatever, you pick up a parameter. So, it is kind of a gradient what you create, so that your reaction can take place in a much more uniform fashion. Because say for example, you have a mixture of different size of particles. So, the reaction time will be very tough to be predicted. Just for your understanding sake, think of a situation. A particle this big, a particle this small, particle this, all different sizes coming through. Now, if I ask you that how much time this thing will take, will be very tough for you to predict as compared to if I give you a second scenario, which is here in the next box what I am drawing now. If this is the box A, and the box B, if you think of it, if I give you a uniform particle size like this, something of that kind, more or less in a uniform range. So, you can do a prediction much better. So, fractionation is a very important tool which comes very handy in terms of the pre-treatment of the feedstock. And by definition, fractionation means, if we go by the technical definition, fractionation is a separation process. As I mentioned you in the beginning, it is a separation process in which certain quantity of mixture, and it could be gas, solid, liquid, is divided during phase transition. Okay. Phase transition into a number of smaller quantities. Okay. In which composition varies according to gradient. Composition varies according to gradient. So, this is the most simplistic definition of fractionation. So, if I had to fractionate this box A, then what I will be getting is something like, in a column I will have this bigger particle sitting somewhere here, then this is say one category, then the second set of particles sitting somewhere here, second category, different groups, and I have the smaller particles sitting around here, which is the category 3. So, these are the different categories by which you can fractionate. Now, in this context, when we talk about the fractionation in terms of, it is very critical to know that nitrogen and alkali content is critical, and as they are partially carried over into the gas stream. So, let me put it down, alkali content is critical. Okay. So, following up the previous one, if we have a way around that, if we could fractionate some of these materials like nitrogen, alkali and all these different kind of things, we may get a better efficiency of the system. So, we talked about the particle size earlier. So, we started with the drying process, then we followed with the particle size, and then we talk about there are ways to separate it out by fractionation, and now we are talking about these two parameters, especially nitrogen. As I have told you in the previous class also, nitrogen can become a big impediment in gasification process, and the alkali content, they are very critical. And what one has to do is that, since these are very critical, as they are partially carried over into the gas stream. So, essentially what is happening, your gas stream which is coming out is now contaminated with nitrogen and alkali. So, small particles tend to contain or have less nitrogen and alkali. So, fractionation into fine and coarse particles helps to produce a gas or product gas with fewer impurities. Okay. So, let us again revise it, what we talked about. We talked about first that the drying, the moisture level should be less than 10% or between 10 to 15, at least less than 15% for sure, and preferable below 10%. Second, we talked about the particle size. We cannot afford to have very fine particles because it may clog the different ports in the gasifier, and we cannot afford to have a very big chunks, the reaction won't happen. So, we have to have somewhere between somewhere in between, which is around 20 to 80 millimeter, what we have talked about. Then we talked about how really to separate them out. One can separate them out using fractionation columns, and while using the fractionation column, there are certain aspects which has to be removed or which has to be minimized very significantly. One of is the nitrogen. We have talked about it in the chemistry part of it, how the nitrogen kind of reduces the calorific value of the fuel. Just in the previous class, if you go through, you will remember it. So, we have to get rid of the nitrogen and we have to get rid of the alkali metals. They could be got rid of if we have a finer particle, not extremely fine we are talking about. If we have a decently fractionated sample of fine and the coarse particles, we can really get rid of much of it. Okay. So, that is why they are all interlinked with each other in terms of the particle, nitrogen content, alkali content, and likewise and so on and so forth. Okay. So, these are some of the basics, followed by last aspect in it is the leaching. Okay. Leaching parameter. So, again coming back, nitrogen and alkali removal with water. This is another route by which you can remove it with water prior to gasification. So, say for example, if we talk about the fresh wood just directly which is from the forest you are getting, it contains 50 to 60% moisture. Okay. Whereas, if we sun dry or air dry, sun or air dried wood, this contains around 20% moisture. Whereas, what we need is to go around preferably below 10 or at least between 10 and 15%. So, this brings us, I told you that there is always a compromise, because when you have to reduce the water content, you have to spend energy. You have to spend certain money or a dollar in order to reduce it. And if you do so, in other words, you are increasing the cost of the final product, because these are all your inputs. Okay. So, most of the pre-treatment revolves around these 4-5 parameters, starting with the water content of the sample or moisture content, whichever we put it, of the sample, step 1. Second thing is the particle size you are dealing with, around 20 to 80 millimeter diameter particle size mostly works for it. And if you can then fractionate the particle at different size classification, the reaction becomes much more faster, and this fractionation process into coarser and finer particle leads to significant removal of nitrogen and alkali metals, which creates a lot of problem in the gasification process in terms of reducing the calorific value, creating clogging, creating really nasty tars and everything into the system. And next approach is, if you can leach out this nitrogen and alkali from the sample by keeping it in water. But if you keep it in water for long water treatment, then you have to have a method to remove that water, which will again consume that extra money in order to get it to below 10% or between 10 to 15% moisture level. And we gave an example that the regular wood which you obtained just fell from the, just cut from the forest, contains around 50 to 60% moisture, and if you sun dry it, you can go down to like around 20%, but still 20% is not good enough. You have to bring it down further. So, these are the basic pre-treatment techniques which are critical before we get into the gasification. So, from here what we will do, we will move on to the next aspect of it, which is basically the feedstock properties. Okay. So, I will close it here. Thank you.